genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat farkından merhabalar. Farklı ülkelerden konuklarla bölgesel ve küresel meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Dünyayı Ekotürk ekranında buluşturuyoruz. Doğum oranları tüm dünyada öngörülenden bile hızlı bir şekilde düşüyor. Türkiye dahil pek çok ülke doğumu teşvik etmek için malum çalışmalar yapıyor. Bir yandan boşanmalarda da ciddi bir artış var. Türkiye'de boşanma hızı 2024'te Cumhuriyet tarihinin zirvesine ulaştı. Tüm bunlar ışığında saat farkında bu hafta biraz bu konuları mercek altına alacağız. King's College London'dan çok kıymetli bir sosyal bilimciyle toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliğine dair neden bazı toplumların diğerlerinden daha eşit olduğunu irdeleyen The Great Gender Divergence adında Princeton'dan yakında çıkacak olan kitabın da yazarı aynı zamanda kendisi. Dr. Alice Evans bizlerle. Hi Dr. Evans, welcome to my show. Thank you very much for your valuable time.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Well, Dr. Evans, of course, global fertility decline all around the world. Birth rates are falling globally, except maybe, I don't know, few places, few islands or hill states that you have traveled. I would like to hear more about that. But let's start with a global birth rates, Dr. Evans. Not just in highly developed countries, but almost all over the world. This is a global phenomenon now. What is really driving this? Of course, there are multiple reasons. Women are increasingly more educated, we have higher female labor force participation, etc. Of course, there's an economic side of it, rising costs, as some people argue, inflation, etc. But what is really driving this? Could you please tell us what do you identify as primary reasons driving this global trend? And we will talk about the exceptions later on.
Thank you so much. So I have been doing research all around the world in 9 different world regions, doing lots of interviews, talking to people, everywhere really, from Morocco to Mexico to Konya to Midyat to Delhi to Beijing, right? And so I think across the world, we see slightly different drivers in different regions. But one common trend is that we see a decline in marriage and coupling. So in Turkey, for example, the marriage rate has gone down. And also we see a rise in divorces.
Right.
So if people are not getting married, or if they're getting married later, maybe at 30, then that reproductive window is shortening. If they're getting divorced within 4 years of marriage, again, there is less likelihood of having children. So that is the biggest issue. It is the decline of marriage and coupling. So of course, costs are relevant. Childcare costs are relevant. Of course, female education is important. But those things aren't a full explanation, because even in very different economies with very different costs, very different rates of female labor force participation, we see exactly the same trend. So for example, in India, in the state of Tamil Nadu, where only 29% of women are working, they have the exact same fertility rate as the UK, where 74% of women are working. So you get these very, very different cultural, economic environments. But the big trend that we see in many, many places is that marriage is falling. And then we can talk about why that might be in different regions.
I will come to also marriage trends and divorce trends, especially globally, and also Middle East and North Africa, MENA region, including Turkey. But regarding this fertility decline, Professor, also, I was going to ask you the common reasons, but you also already touched upon. I also wonder one more thing. At the end of the day, it is a woman, of course, issue. Women do not produce babies anymore, so we have this fertility. But there is also the male side of the story. So I personally really wonder, what do men think? We have low fertility because women don't want babies anymore, or men have the same feelings, same sentiment. What did you see, what did you realize when you talk to males around the globe?
Thank you so much. So I think in some parts of the world that are culturally liberalizing, that are becoming more individualistic, The stigma and shame of being single is declining. So previously, for example, when I did research in Konya with older men and women, everyone has to marry. It's an absolute must, right? In conservative older societies. But now, with newer generations, as they're getting greater freedoms, then maybe there's less stigma of staying single. So that's certainly one issue. So, for example, in China, in the USA, men may decide that they've also got a whole new range of freedoms and they may enjoy spending their evenings on very hyper engaging social media, video games, World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, Premier League, right? Having fun on your phone rather than having to, deal with the hassle of women. So all those things, like one, cultural liberalization, two, those social connections may be being outcompeted by hyper engaging media. And we know across the world in many places that people are spending more and more times on their phone. But so, yeah, the phones can create some frictions, the liberalization creates some frictions. So, for example, 2 years ago, the top streaming song globally was Miley Cyrus's Flowers, right? So I can buy myself flowers.
I can buy myself flowers, yes.
Yeah, so that even in Saudi Arabia, that was the most streamed song. And I think, that reflects a shift towards, some more individual autonomy, etc. But I don't think that's a full explanation of what's going on in Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia isn't the Miley Cyrus story.
Right. Interesting. I've never thought about this Flowers song and it's how it is related to this staying single. So there is this promotion of staying single, being single, and this is the main cause of the decline in fertility rates. Am I true?
Okay, so let me clarify a little bit. So I think, let's take the Konya, the 80-year-old woman in Konya. Previously, it was just an absolute must that people had to get married and have children, right? Otherwise, you were shamed, you were stigmatized. But in many parts of the world, we see increasingly progressive media. So that people, for example, people in Gaziantep, people in Midyat, people in Mardin can use their own phones to do what I call cultural leapfrogging, in that rather than just necessarily watching Turkish movies or your show, for example, they could even watch, more progressive, more egalitarian shows. So one possibility then is that women might be becoming more progressive and wanting more equality and a bit more freedoms, whereas men might be staying more conservative, for example. So with people that I've interviewed in Istanbul, you'll find that people often say that women are becoming more progressive, that they're watching shows on Netflix, for example, because they're able to curate their own media, they're able to choose what they want to watch, and they're increasingly gravitating to shows that affirm women's status and autonomy and freedoms, whereas men might be staying a bit more conservative. So that's one issue that can create a little bit of a friction in some contexts. So I think in Latin America, I think in China, that could be a little bit of a friction. So that's one issue about another reason why social media come into it. But I don't think that's the main cause in the Middle East and North Africa.
Very interesting, Dr. Evans. Historically, why was marriage so high, do you think, and why is it low today? Of course, you touched upon many reasons, but a lot of people, including many in my family, say women simply don't have the economic need for men anymore. Is it the case? And how does this compare to countries where female employment rates are very low?
Okay, so that's a great point. So I think in the past, in many societies, especially in low-income societies where there was little support from the state, people would often build trusted alliances through marriage, right? So, for example, where I was in Kurdish regions of Midyat, for example, that's a key, that different families would consolidate family loyalty through cousin marriage, for example. And that's a way of affirming family bonds, family loyalty, family trust, right across the Middle East and North Africa. Cousin marriage is very important for strengthening the family, keeping the family strong, keeping wealth in the family, building these ties. Or even, more widely in India or in China, then arranged marriages were super, super common and important for building these ties. I mean, that's how, human societies that were anti-marriage would not have had so many children and would not have done so well reproductively. So you could see some evolutionary angle. Evolution would favor a pro-marriage and fertility society, right?
Right. What were some of the, by the way, most surprising findings from your travels, Dr. Evans? I really wonder, because I saw on your social media that your last trip was to Himachal Pradesh, India's hill state, and also you traveled all around the world. You spent a lot of months in some countries. So what were some of your most shocking, most surprising findings, I wonder, when you talk to males and females?
That's a great question. I'll tell you, for example, when I was in Konya, I met a young woman and she, very pious, very modest. But instantly, within maybe 4 seconds of meeting her, I noticed that she had the exact same mannerisms of like Nicki Minaj and Kim Kardashian, like do it exactly the same thing with her hands. And just through watching her hands, I realized again this concept of cultural leapfrogging, that anyone with a smartphone, instead of listening to the local imam, instead of listening to what their family says is right and proper, instead of listening to what their neighbors say is respectable or for a good woman, any woman with a smartphone can culturally leapfrog to curate and choose her own content, right? So smartphones, in a way, enable people to curate their own content and to some extent come apart. So that I found very, very striking, that I could tell just by looking at her hands, hey, wait a minute, something strange is happening here with technology and cultural
Wow.
change.
Well, I was actually going to ask you the rise of digital technologies and social media, how it has influenced declining marriage and fertility rates. But I wasn't expecting this. This is interesting. So there is also this huge impact of digital technologies and social media, right?
I think that's one potential friction, but I think another really important thing in the case of Konya, Turkey more broadly, the Middle East and North Africa, is, and actually I'll tell you about a really cool paper, not mine, but by other academics at Meta. So what they do is they analyze Facebook connections, whether men and women have Facebook ties. And what they find is that across the world, there is massive diversity. In the Middle East, Anatolia, and North Africa, men have very few female connections, right? And I think that reflects a wider cultural norm whereby male honor depends on female seclusion and chastity. So in some conservative communities, maybe it's not so permissible for men and women to mix and mingle, right? If you go to some conservative parts of Gaziantep, you'll find a cafe and it's just for men, right?
Right.
And this is also correlated with very lower than average levels of female labor force participation. So in this region, one, we've seen the decline of the arranged marriage. But then if couples are to meet by themselves, and on top of that, if people have fewer children, so you get fewer cousins, so you're less likely to marry your cousin, then marriages only happen if people are mix and mingling and find people they love, right? If people find people they're attracted to. But that's a little bit difficult. It's difficult to find a man that you're attracted to, that you want to build a family with, if you're not really supposed to have so many male friends. So, I'm sure, in parts of Istanbul, like Kadıköy, there are men and women who hang out at cafes and bars, etc., right? Those are the cool kids of Kadıköy. But, parts of Konya are very, very different. Even 5 years ago, maybe in Konya, if a woman walked down the street without a hijab, maybe people would look, right? So Konya is this tradition of being much more conservative. And in conservative places like Konya, where it's not so acceptable for women and men to mix, maybe one exception is like the university students who do hang out, etc. If it's not acceptable for women and men to mix, then what happens is, one, it's difficult to find a husband. So lots of the Turkish women I've interviewed, but also Egyptian and Moroccan, Tunisian, they might say, I don't actually know that many men, right? Because she might damage her reputation if she was hanging up chatting to men, right? So might tar her reputation, her status. Even her brother might be quite cross or if she was seen fraternizing with men, right? So if you've got those strong ideals of gender segregation, it's harder to find a loving relationship. So that can lead to marital delay. And then on top of that, let us suppose that you do get married, but within a week, within a year, you decide, actually, because I didn't really know this person, I don't really love them, and we're having arguments, we're having disputes, we're not seeing eye to eye, we're kind of incompatible.
Yeah, you get a divorce more easily, maybe.
Yes, exactly. So if you have this combination whereby you idealize gender segregation and you also think divorce is permissible, then one, you should expect to have delayed marriage, pushing it up into 30. And then two, you might expect to have quite a short reproductive window. So for example, and I think, so I've interviewed people in Konya again, whereby, they found that they had disagreements within the first year of marriage, so the couple decided to part ways. Or maybe as society becomes more gender equal and understanding, if he's violent support, they might leave quickly. And, to some extent, that's a tremendous advance for gender equality, right? So
Yeah.
many grandmothers in England, Turkey, India, China alike were trapped in abusive relationships.
Right.
So in many ways, this represents a great step forward for gender equality, for women's freedoms, for women's well-being, that they are no longer trapped in these abusive relationships.
Yeah, in that case, definitely. And by the way, probably you
Yes.
know, but Turkey's divorce rate broke a historic record in 2024, the highest figure recorded ever in the modern Turkish Republic. So ironically also, this is the year of family as announced by the government.
Yeah, I saw. Yes, I saw. So, Erdogan has said, I think Erdogan recognizes that marriage is really, really important for fertility. But the problem is, if you still idealize gender segregation, if you still idealize female seclusion, then how are men and women supposed to meet, identify someone whom they can have, intimate friendships, trust, rapport, charm, and bond? And it's not just how do you meet the person, but also if you're not that familiar with mixing and mingling with the opposite sex, you might feel more uncomfortable or not know really how to relate to women and build strong female friendships. So if men and women are always kept apart, it's just much harder to, one, build those bonds, two, find the one that you're going to be absolutely committed to and having a loving, happy relationship with, right? So I'm not here saying, we want people to be married at any cost. I'm saying, we surely want loving, happy relationships. And that depends on people developing social skills and people having the freedom to find someone they're compatible with.
But even if they, let's assume that they get married, they are happy, there's a happy ending. Couples don't prefer to have kids in the early stage of the marriage, at least, or they postpone. How is the trend here after getting married?
Well, right, great question. Yeah, so we might see. So then you see a little bit of an issue because let's suppose it's much harder to find a girlfriend if you are keeping your distance, right? But then if you are delaying and only getting married at 30, then maybe if you start having your child at 33, then maybe your reproductive window is
Right.
much, much smaller. So maybe you'll only have one, right? And I don't want to be misinterpreted as someone saying, women have got to pump out babies, but it's really not it's not an issue of, too much. Lots of people say, oh, it's a problem of too much feminism. And I think in the Middle East and North Africa and Anatolia, that's not the case at all. It's these real restrictions making it harder for people to find loving, happy companionship.
I see. Dr. Evans, also I will ask your opinion on an article which I recently read, Professor Claudia Golden's recent paper, Babies and the Macroeconomy. She says rapid economic growth leads to a clash between traditional gender roles, contributing to declining fertility rates. And she also focuses on gender inequality and labor division at home. So even in progressive societies, women still take on most childcare and household duties, except the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway, where men share more domestic responsibilities, and there is a higher fertility rate. So given your research, how do you assess the impact of rapid economic development on gender roles and fertility rates, particularly in societies where traditional norms still persist?
Thank you so much. So that's a great question. And Claudia Golden is, of course, an absolute trailblazer who has done so much for women in economics and massively advanced our understanding of gender equality. Now, with that particular paper, so she argues that when economic growth is really rapid, like in South Korea, women will seize economic opportunities, but men's ideas might be much slower to change. They will stay much more conservative, and she says that creates a mismatch. And one limitation of that paper is that her sample focuses on these very rapid industrializers, like, for example, South Korea. If we expand the sample and say include Latin America, where there's been much slower economic growth, right? Latin American countries are much, much poorer than, say, South Korea. We still see this exact same trend. So in Chile, in Colombia, the fertility rate is almost 1. Rather than say 2, which is the replacement rate. So I don't think the economics can be a full explanation. What I think is really happening in Latin America is that Latin America, because of that digital technology, they're able to connect, share ideas, become much more progressive, and they're campaigning, they're protesting, they're demanding much greater respect and autonomy, and men are maybe not at the same level. On top of this, as society liberalizes, some men are saying, actually, I can't really be bothered with marriage. Like, I don't really want the responsibility. So,
Right.
as societies liberalize, men don't feel that they have to do it. So, I think it's more about cultural change that's occurring irrespective of the speed of development. But that said, I have all the praise in the world for Claudia Goldin.
Of course. And then economic incentives will not really work because a lot of governments all around the world have been trying to push this, so many economic and financial incentives to increase the fertility rates, but they seem to have a limited success in reversing declining birth rate. What are the alternative policy measures that could effectively address this issue, or this could not be reversed anymore?
Okay, so I think it is absolutely correct that we try to reverse the falling fertility because it has massive economic implications. So, for example, in Turkey, if the entire population ages, then that means fewer workers, lower productivity, increasing rates of dependency, and you might have one man providing for two sets of parents, right? So it really means a slower, less dynamic economy with very high rates of dependency. And then if the man is supporting two sets of parents because maybe the woman is not working, she is a housewife, then he will have to lower his consumption, right? Because he is providing for those parents. If he lowers his consumption, he's not spending on local goods and services. So the whole economy could grind to a halt. And it also, if the government wants to if the government is spending on healthcare or pensions, for example, for formal sector workers, then it's got less money to spend on other things. So it's really, I'd say it's the biggest economic crisis of our lifetime, right? It's a real challenge, especially for countries like Turkey. Okay, so what can we do about it? Yeah, so you're totally right that the available evidence suggests that when governments offer these pronatal baby bonuses, that doesn't really seem to do much. Maybe it does a little bit, but it's not reversing the big trend. So if I am correct, that part of the decline in fertility is due to the decline in coupling, and in Turkey, that's partly due to social conservative ideas of gender segregation, as well as the distracting smartphones and hyper engaging social media. Then I think, in all honesty, what we want is to celebrate love and falling in love for schools, for universities to create social spaces, to create community events, to make it more acceptable for young men and women to fall in love, right? So if Erdogan wants families, he also needs to champion love, right? I would like to see the Erdogan agenda.
I love this. Dr. Evans, well, I also want to ask you so many personal observations as well. So
yes.
Was there any country or a city or town that surprised you in a way that female participation, labor division at home, and also considerably high fertility rates, so like a perfect dream society? Have you ever been to such place, I wonder?
I think one of the most fascinating things about Turkey, for example, is its massive cultural diversity. So, for example, I gave a talk at Kadir Has in Istanbul. And, if you go to their Starbucks, within 10 minutes, you'll see like 10 crop tops. If you go around the back to Fatih, then you'll see, a very, very conservative sect. So, Turkey has always had this phenomenal cultural diversity. And I think that's one of, Turkey's great strengths. And then the question is, how can we identify the different locally binding constraints in each community, right? So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all model for all of the Turkish communities, right? So in places like, Fatih, which is much more conservative in Istanbul, then the key bottleneck is the gender segregation, which makes it much harder to find someone that you love and that you're going to have a long-term coupling relationship with. Maybe in places like Kadir Has, that's less of a constraint. What you really want to do is stop people from spending so much time on their phones and encouraging mixing and mingling, right? So I think that's one of the biggest insights from my research, is that by learning from all that tremendous diversity, we think, okay, what are the real binding constraints? What are the real bottlenecks here? And how can we use the latest evidence to engage with them? And as for your final question about what's the most egalitarian society, definitely Sweden. I was in Sweden 3 weeks ago. It's very common during the middle of the day to see like a group of guys pushing their prams and pushchairs. It's really crazy and shocking. So there is tremendous diversity around the world, but I think Sweden has done the best to get towards gender equality.
So there are lots of things to learn from them then.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's also the story about love. So where love is celebrated and where men are so devoted to their wives or girlfriends that they care about women's welfare and they want to put them first, then they say, yeah, sure, I'll share the washing up. So like love is such an important driver of all these things. If you fall in love, you're more likely to couple and marry, and you're more likely to close that gender gap in care work because men want their wives to be happy. So I'm a big advocate of love.
But I'm not sure if that can eventually lead to a more for higher fertility rates, because still you can love someone, you can have a long relationship, you can get married, but you can live happily ever after without kids, right?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. But I mean, if we look at the data, the biggest diversity, the biggest driver of the real collapse in fertility is not that couples are having fewer children, but rather people are less likely to marry. And this is also a class issue. So in South Korea, in Finland, in Sweden, and also in the US, it's often the poorest men who are struggling to couple up, right? So if you think that, people are looking for a package of goods in a partner, does he have a good education? Does he have a nice job? Is he charming? Is he affectionate? Is he funny? Is he sweet? A man who is struggling economically is going to be a less attractive package, right? And so that brings us to another way in which we can tackle the fall. If we're interested in coupling, we need to think, how do we support these men, one in the labor market, but also in the marriage market? So in Turkey, for example, and across the world, women are increasingly going to higher education at higher rates of men. But if men don't go to universities, then they usually go into, say, construction or manufacturing or struggling to get a job. But the problem is automation, as the great Turkish Daron Acemoglu has highlighted, that if you have automation, then you might be displacing a lot of those labor-intensive manual jobs in construction, etc., and manufacturing. So that means that the least educated Turkish men will really, really struggle to match up. So, lots of times when people talk about childless cat ladies or single women, they think of it as like they think of it as if it's like the Kadir Has women, right? But it's not the Kadir Has women. Actually, the people who are much more likely to struggle are those more disadvantaged men. So that draws in the importance of economics. And that's why we should always listen to Daron.
Definitely, definitely, Dr. Evans. Well, thank you so much. Time is up. It was a wonderful conversation. Thanks a lot, and let's wish for more love, more romance, more babies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too, thanks.
Bye.
Evet, King's College London'dan çok kıymetli bir sosyal bilimciyi ağırladık bugün. Doktor Alice Evans, düşen doğum oranlarını dünya genelinde, yükselen boşanma oranlarını, bu toplumsal meseleleri irdelemeye çalıştık. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla karşınızda olmak dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.